David Brewster here with an episode of Scales and Tales, and this is part 2 of Pentatonic Puzzles. And I did have a good response and some feedback from the previous installment, so I thought I'd follow that with another, take on this lesson or another version of Pentatonic Puzzles. And this lesson is actually going to dive a little bit deeper as far as reworking the notes, finding different ways of kind of traveling through and, using the shapes and fingerings for the scale. And it does seem like a lot of, guitarists, once they learn it and they've learned some licks, it seems like the next thing they want to do is throw the scale away. It's too easy, or it's too simple, or it doesn't sound dark enough, or it doesn't sound heavy enough, or whatever the complaint is. But you definitely don't want to throw away pentatonic scales. They're very useful. They're eternally capable of, being reworked and reformed and recycled in different ways. You can approach it in different ways. And there's a ton of things you can do with this very popular and common scale, and that's what this lesson is going to focus on. Much like the first episode, the first thing we have to do is pick a key. So we're going to change keys. We're going to get away from G, which is what we had in the first lesson in this series. And I just chose C sharp minor, mainly because it's one of my favorite keys. It's very accessible and usable, on the guitar. And I don't know, I find myself kind of gravitating towards C sharp minor. I do like the key. So let's just put it right here in the box, just a standard minor pentatonic in C sharp. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to help you learn how to play that scale completely differently. Because if that's how you find yourself playing it, ascending and descending just straight through it like this. First thing we're going to do is we're going to change that, because there's nothing wrong with that. But if you were playing a solo, you're not going to play a solo that sounds like that. It just sounds like a scale. It sounds like an exercise. It's not very musical. The first step as far as changing how you play that scale is we're going to just basically lock into the box fingering for this lesson. The example at the very end of this lesson is going to move between, different positions. So it's going to push everything that we've focused on in this lesson into a new, arena or a new way of playing it. But we're just going to lock into the box just to kind of exhaust all these different approaches and ideas, and I'm going to kind of shake things up. So the first thing we're going to do is, instead of ascending through the scale and ascending through the notes, let's reverse the order of the notes on the neck. So we're still going to ascend, but instead of climbing up, we're going to basically descend like this. And that simple little variation suddenly makes the scale sound radically different. Now flip that and do it the other way. Hammer on, but then descend through the scale. And if you want a good example of this, the first time I really noticed that sequence, I was trying to play Where Were You by Jeff Beck, and I heard this. And my ear heard that, and I was like, I think that's pentatonic. But then I'd never really played it that way, ascending but descending with the notes. And it really confused my fingers. So that's not in the right key for Where Were You? Where Were You would be up here. Or whatever. But when I hear that sequence, it definitely catches my ear because it sounds different. It's not the typical standard sequence of notes. And of course he targets that sixth and then slides into that B note right there, the seventh. But everything else is pretty much pentatonic except for that one note. So apply that idea to the whole scale. And then flip it around the other way. With the hope of finding some new things to do with this scale, let's approach it differently. So it's 2 notes per string. So what would happen if we basically just target one of the 2 notes on each string and we alternated? Something like this. And even though you can still recognize that it's minor pentatonic, something changed. It's a different cycle of notes. you can flip it the other way, and you could grab the notes that you didn't play, you know, ascending and descending. You know, something like that. And it's just a slight, you know, change in the way that you're viewing that scale, you know, and how you're approaching those notes and performing them. And little, you know, variations like that can create a whole new, you know, chapter of licks or ideas and phrases. So if you're working on some sequences, you can definitely kind of target some different approaches. You know, I've seen lots of, you know, lessons and examples of, you know, running thirds and fourths and, you know, doing sixes and things like that. And I've talked about that, you know, in a few lessons on this channel already. But this is the D Martini sequence, or D Martini sequence. And I've seen other guitarists mention this in that way. You know, Paul Gilbert, I think, has referred to this as the D Martini sequence. And it's something like this. And there you can see we're just kind of twisting our way 3 notes at a time through the scale. And we're kind of using, you know, a pull-off at certain areas through that sequence. Now, once you get that under your belt, you can double pick the first note in every, you know, every spot, like this. And even Paul Gilbert himself has a variation of that, something like this. And slowly you're just kind of combining both of the first 2 sequences we had, the original D Martini and the double picked, but it's, you know, just kind of a variation of that, which is like that. And we talked about that sequence actually in the Paul Gilbert 3-for-All that I did last year. If you're looking for kind of a left field, you know, different approach to playing the scale, just leapfrog through it, you know, string skip, like this. And we're literally just jumping, you know, every other string through the scale like this. Very simple string skipping idea, but if you apply that to the pentatonic or really any scale, it really opens up the sound and sounds radically different, and I like that. But then you could also grab, you know, 3 strings on the way up, and then go back and then grab the strings you skipped over, like that. And I just like mixing those notes around and trying different things in different ways. Now, speaking of trying things in different ways and using string skipping, the last example here I'm actually going to share is moving through, you know, 4 positions of C# minor pentatonic, and we're string skipping our way up. So it looks like this. And then slowly what we're doing that original string skip right here. So there's, you know, pentatonic shape 1, move to shape 2, and then you have the same fingering but on different strings. You know, the minor third and then that whole step. And then when you move to the next position up here, you're going to basically mimic that same fingering but backwards. So you're going to have the minor, the whole step and then the minor third. And then when you shift in the next position right there, do that again, the whole step and minor third. So it's string skipping through the positions of, you know, C# minor pentatonic, but we're also just kind of blurring our way up there to grab that high B so we can finish, you know, bending to C#. Now you can also descend too. And I just really like that sequence. You know, you can hear it kind of leaping and jumping through the scale, and it's intervallic in a way because it doesn't really follow a set, you know, sequence of notes. But it's just really interesting to kind of find those connecting patterns and notice how, the fingering's kind of flipped as we moved across the strings too. That's going to wrap this episode of Scales and Tails. And the important thing here, aside from learning, what I've shared, is really, be aware of the approach that I'm using. I'm kind of freely just playing through that scale, but I'm making sure that I'm not just going straight up and down. I'm doing something different. I'm jumping over strings or incorporating the notes, in different groupings or patterns. And that's really important because that's going to help you kind of break out of some of those, typical pentatonic phrases. And it's going to help you feel like you're not trapped in a box anymore. Especially, if you move away from the box. There are 5 positions in the minor pentatonic scale, and we really only targeted 1 of the 5. We did hit a few, with that last lick that kind of climbed up. But apply what we did in the box to the other 4 positions in the minor pentatonic scale, then you can change keys. You can start, weaving between minor pentatonic and the blues scale. You can weave between minor pentatonic and maybe the natural minor scale, Aeolian, or whatever. I mean, you can definitely start combining and mixing and blurring that minor pentatonic line. So good luck with this, and let me know how it goes too. So leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content material. Thank you.